This week on the Steel Report.
I can tell you this from my past as an alcoholic, that did not play well long term because I felt awful.
And I think that he opens up the possibility for them to live more fuller lives, and I think that's really amazing.
The Domestic Dad Project, rooted in sobriety and helping fathers everywhere clean up the mess. And our program begins right now.
Now from KWWL, this is the Steel Report.
And welcome to the Steel Report for this week. Of course, it's Father's Day weekend, and my guest is here to talk about being a great dad. His name is Nick Barnett, and Nick has established a very unique program called the Domestic Dad Project. Nick, welcome to the show. And I noticed your wife, Gabby, who actually, as a disclaimer, works here at KWWL. She's a great sales executive. But she says this project, Domestic Dad, is rooted in sobriety.
That's correct.
So that means something happened in your life that made you realize you needed to make a change to become a better father. Talk a little bit about your past, how we got to this point.
Yeah, sobriety is something that I have embraced for a couple years now. Just got to a breaking point in my life where I just decided that it was time for a change, and after trying so many times throughout my life and kind of getting into the routine of getting sober and then falling down or relapsing or failing in that process, you learn a lot about yourself and you learn a lot about the process that works for you. So yeah, just got to a breaking point and decided it was time for a change and went for it.
So let's show a little bit of video of your family. Talk a little bit about them, your wife and kids.
Yeah, I'm married to my beautiful wife, Gabby Barnett, who, to your point, she works here. She's a great sales executive here. I have my oldest son is 21 years old. His name's Zach Barnett. He works over at Dandiri Toyota. He's a great sales associate, loaded with empathy. He is just one of the best humans you'll ever meet. My middle son, Ari, who's 12 years old, he plays basketball, soccer, and he's going into the 7th grade. He's awesome. And then our youngest, Jamie, who's 4 years old and he may be the death of me at some point, but he is just my pride and joy. So.
Well, it's great to be able to see you interacting with them in this type of video, so I do appreciate you letting me shoot the video.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, was there a point, and it happens to so many people, where you hit rock bottom? Was there something that happened that triggered this idea that I need to get sober and do something that is actually helpful to society? Yeah. Because I'm saying, what if somebody watches this program and says, I remember Nick Barnett.
Yeah.
I met him in a bar and he was really obnoxious.
Yes.
You know?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. There was a series of events, and those range from drinking at home and becoming not the person that I wanted to be once everybody else came back into the house. There was, just getting very foggy, not remembering a lot of what was going on during the weekends. And, my kids and my wife were not getting the best version of myself. So I really I felt a need for change. Yeah, and I think a lot of us go through that. I think a lot of people have gone through that in the past years, especially post-COVID.
I want to follow up a little bit on your own your wife and your family intervened, and actually, whether you realize it or not, probably saved your life. So tell me a little bit about that day.
Yeah, it was May 18th, 2022, and I had been drinking that day, early in the morning till mid-afternoon, and my mom had come over around 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the afternoon when she had gotten off work, which I thought was pretty strange, and she had told me, she goes, Nick, you're gonna die. And if you die from this, everything that I've done in my life would not have been worth it. And that really hit me in the heart. And, my wife was there and her concern was the same. And, I was reminded at that point that I have 3 children, 3 sons that do depend on their father. I was very close to leaving them with a legacy that was different from what I had hoped at that point in my life.
I certainly appreciate your honesty. It's difficult to talk about, but the intervention part for so many people has been a lifesaver. Now you're trying to, I hate to use the word pay it forward, but here you are, domestic dad, and maybe somebody watching will say, well, what makes Nick an expert in this subject? And I would say your life experience helps make you an expert. Yeah.
Yes, in my experience, what has helped me is peer work. People who I've been able to lean into that have traversed all of the obstacles of addiction, and that's been substantial in my journey. And to your point, Ron, I do want to pay it forward. I do want to create a line of communication for people, for dads specifically, who are looking for some support, who are looking for somewhere to lean into, but not just in the realm of sobriety, but also with topics like emotional regulation, with topics like empathy, with understanding the difference between shame and guilt, and being able to move forward from those things, because it's been extremely empowering for me.
How did you feel though that day? Did you feel anger, like, oh, I'm not going to do this, I'm not having a problem, or did you finally realize and say it out loud? You know.
For so many years, Ron, there was the, I don't have a problem, and that's part of the journey, when, the lack of understanding for the issue that's happening. Knowing that you have a problem and how to understand it and deal with it is a huge part of that process. But on that day, I decided to put my palms up and just be submissive to the fact that, I was an addict, and to this day I still am, and that's a huge part of what keeps me in check every single day. Somebody once told me that you can't stay clean on yesterday's shower, and that's so true in so many different ways, especially when it comes to addiction.
In fact, you've made such a change that you're now a licensed peer addiction recovery coach.
Yeah. I am a peer addiction and recovery coach. There was a program that was offered through the University of Iowa, and that program links up with another program out on the East Coast called CCAR.
Yeah, the program you're talking about is called the Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery Program, and the University of Iowa offers that. You have a podcast that really focuses on a goal of what? Making dads better dads, right?
Yeah, giving them an understanding of how to parent well. But even more so than that, the Domestic Dad Project is rooted in sobriety. And that's a big part of my history, my past, and what I see for men moving forward as an opportunity should you want to figure out how to do that, right? So what I do is addiction and recovery coaching. But once I got actually into that field and said, hey guys, I'm an addiction and recovery coach, what happened was nobody really reached out. And that only raised red flags around the fact that the stigma of saying, hey, men need help is real. And so what I did to create a zero entry into sobriety, something that I didn't really have, was just a resource to lean into. And that's what the podcast is for men to lean into sobriety, and we want to create an environment or a community that has people that they can lean into.
So the particular podcast that I sat in on, in your studio, the studio is actually in your home, right?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, yeah.
Yeah, it took some convincing from my wife, but I think she had her hands on it from the very beginning. My brother had bought me a podcast microphone for Christmas.
Well, I need one of those.
And I unwrapped that, and I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? And we had a spare bedroom in our house that had become kind of a storage room. So I really was like, hey, honey, I really want to clear this out, and I want to build this into a place for me to work and a place to record this podcast. And she said, okay, let's do it. So I went out, I found the boom arms, the audio interface, and all the things that you need. But I think it's a really important thing to note that, I had started the podcast and recorded one episode. And I really wasn't satisfied with it. And it was right before I had started my volunteering for a program called Momentum. I went over to my brother's house, and my sister-in-law, his wife, asked me, hey Nick, how's the podcast doing? And I said, I don't know, it's going okay. And she told me, she said, you know who you should talk to? Danielle McGo. And I said, how do I get a hold of Danielle?
At UNI.
At UNI. Right. She said, I don't know how you get a hold of her, but she's got a podcast called Plan Goal Plan. It's in the top 2% globally, and that's that's somebody you might talk to. She teaches podcasting at UNI. I said, okay, great. So I wrote her name down, and I never really thought anything of it. The next day I went into volunteer. I took some time off work. I was volunteering over at the Momentum program on Independence Avenue in Waterloo. And I had got there, and they said, hey, you're just going to hand out some applications today. And I kind of took a step back, and I said, God, what do you have here for me? I went back to it, and I handed out all the applications that I could. 10 minutes later, an older couple walked in, probably in their 70s. One of them.
Be careful now.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, Ron. Jim and Mary Dick. Jim was a retired school teacher, and Mary had worked in corrections, but they were the people who actually facilitated the interviews at that program. And they said, hey, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm Nick. I'm building the Domestic Dad Project, and explained it to them, and they thought that was really cool. And I said, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. And they looked at each other kind of like, wow, that's interesting. And they said, that is very interesting because our daughter has a podcast. Her name's Danielle McGough. She teaches podcasting at UNI. And I was like, holy smokes. I mean, you have one of those moments where it's kind of like
a God
goosebumps.
moment, where God places you in the
Yes.
his world of people that he knows.
Yeah. So immediately I reached out to Danielle, and she did help me build what is now known as Domestic Dad Cleaning Up the Mess, which is the name of the podcast.
Domestic Dad Cleaning Up the Mess. Wow, what a great way to put that.
We're going to go there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
And when we come back, we're going to check in on the Domestic Dad podcast and continue our discussion with founder Nick Barnett. And you'll hear from UNI professor and highly successful podcaster Danielle McGough and learn why Danielle agreed to get involved in helping Nick set up his Domestic Dad podcast.
Well, I think that when I was talking to Nick, it became so clear to me how much his heart was in the project.
Much more on the Steel Report coming up next. And welcome back to this week's edition of the Steel Report on Father's Day weekend. And appropriately, we are talking with a father here, Nick Barnett. If you were watching our first segment, his Domestic Dad Project created here in just the last few months. What's the driving force behind that again?
Yeah, so after I had gotten sober and I was about 9 months into it, someone that was very near and dear to my heart, who I looked at as a Superman in my life, fell to addiction. And it was very hard for me to understand that. Very soon after that had happened, I had a friend who got too far into the bottle and lost his life, all of which were fathers. Another friend of mine was less than 2 weeks later, passed away from addiction. So all of those men were fathers, and it really got to a point where I said, what do I need to do to try to make a change?
Connecting the dots here.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge tool.
yeah.
So here's one of your podcasts, a recent episode, and your guest is a pretty well-known life coach here in the area. This is John Church, and he has JC Christian Counseling and Life Coaching. He had 4 ideas for dealing with emotional regulation.
Emotional regulation, what is it? So my definition of it is managing your emotions effectively so that you can respond rather than react to difficult situations and even difficult people. And here's the deal, here's why it's so important, because just about every problem or struggle that a man encounters has something at some level to do with how he's managing his emotions.
Yeah.
And as guys, if we can get better at that, then we can really mitigate some of the struggle in our life. And in some areas, we can completely eliminate it. A lot of it has to do with just how well we're managing our emotions. And we don't, as guys, it's not always intuitive to us how to do that.
Oh man, there's so many examples that I can think of, not only from my own life.
That's something that I think that we all struggle with as parents, is how to regulate our emotions and how to model well for our children. Regulating your emotions people can fall down in that aspect to a certain degree with, just blowing up, getting angry, letting things consume you, and that never ends well, especially when drugs and alcohol are involved in that.
Well, I was going to say, as I was listening to this podcast, you told a story about how you had an emotional outburst and in front of your son, and that did not go well. So let's listen to how you put that on your podcast.
Yeah.
I can remember a situation where, maybe I was in an intolerant place, and my son was doing something that I didn't like, and he kept doing it, and I was like, and my emotions came out. And the repercussions from that were, he recoiled, and he recoiled in a way where it startled me, because I could see what my emotions did to him. And man, I can tell you this from my past as an alcoholic, that did not play well long term, because I felt awful.
Yeah.
The shame, right, that came with that emotional outburst, it hurt me, and I wanted to sedate it, and I wanted to get rid of it. So what I turned to was drink it away, right? Let's try to forget about it. And that just became this cyclical thing. So there's just, I think a lot of dads struggle, not only just with that situation. That situation is probably unique to me, or maybe it is, maybe it's not. But I think a lot of us find ourselves in similar situations.
So I thought that was a really, thoughtful and honest story about how we all have a tendency to lose control of our emotions, and the way John referred to that, and how you have to deal with that, and how we all deal with that differently is quite important. You have a Facebook page, you have a website where you have a lot of merchandise, and that's kind of where you started selling merchandise, huh?
Yeah, so after I'd gotten sober, I don't know how much you want me to unpack here, but after I'd gotten sober, I started to lose people, to addiction, close friends, people that were fathers. And that really inspired me to start the Domestic Dad Project, to create a brand that said, hey, we support breaking the stigma around men reaching out for help to get their lives back on track, to become better fathers so they can create a better life for their children. So that started as a website and a Facebook page. And as that started to grow and the merchandise started to go out, what happened was, I got educated on what it looks like to actually create a solution for that. And as I got educated in that arena, I found out that the stigma was real, and not a lot of people wanted to reach out and say, hey, I need help too. So that's what drove me to creating the podcast, to create a zero entry point for our community, to say, hey, I want to learn a little bit more about that. And the podcast, it features coaches, mentors, resources, but it also features men who have traversed the journey of addiction and come out the other side. So it's really meant to inspire people who listen, that are looking to enter into a life of sobriety or a better life as a father.
At UNI, Danielle McGew is a highly successful podcaster and podcasting coach. Her audio podcast called Plan, Goal, Plan is a highly ranked podcast among the 4 million podcasts out there right now. Danielle said she met with Nick about helping him with his podcast.
It takes a lot of work to start a podcast. It's a lot of fun, and it takes a vision, and it takes really knowing what your audience needs. And so, we started out, we talked about, what do you want the title to be? We talk about, what's your promise of your podcast, and how can you deliver that to the people that you serve, and how can you think through what your episodes are. And then, you make an intro jingle and an outro jingle, and you got to learn all the technology and editing, and then thinking about, okay, so now you've created an episode, how the heck do you get people to listen to it? And so we talked a lot about SEO too. So how can you use terms, that search engine optimization, how can you use terms, and that the people that want to listen to your podcast, that's what they be searching. So actually so much of it is, who are your listeners, and how do you serve them? How do you give them the things that are going to really help them? Things were not only personally on the line for him, but that he's really committed to helping other people and to find a way to spread the message that by, cleaning up their messes and getting sober, that it would not only make their lives so much better, but that as dads, they have the ability to really change the lives of their entire families. And so, I think for me, I want to work with people that want to serve, and he wants to serve.
Time management, number 2.
Remember earlier, Nick mentioned the Momentum Program, a Waterloo program at One City United out on Independence Avenue.
One City is really about filling gaps and equipping people in the Cedar Valley. And Momentum is a program under One City. We have 4 programs actually under One City. We have a connection app to send people to resources. We have Momentum, and I'm the Momentum director, and Momentum is on its 19th term. And we work with people with the barrier to employment, and what we do is we help them gain skills. So Nick has started something that we really believe in, that we see needs to happen in the Cedar Valley.
That was a me thing.
Domestic Dad Project is a non-profit. The idea is to help people.
Yeah, it's a nonprofit in which I do not sit on the board of. So I leaned into the community, a community of people that I know were passionate about dads getting their lives back on track, so they could become better fathers, right? And that's what that nonprofit is for. So all proceeds from T-shirts, from anything that you see with Domestic Dad Project on it, from the podcast to T-shirts to just anything, is all of that can be found at domesticdadproject.com. But that's we're building it.
Yeah, you've probably seen that throughout the interview. I've put that up a couple of times. The address again is
www.domesticdadproject.com.
Your podcast and Domestic Dad Project is a place to turn where you offer the tools to help.
Yeah, from a baseline standpoint, we have merchandise that says anybody who wears it is saying, we support dads who want to get their lives back on track. The podcast that we created is for outreach to say, hey, this is me being completely vulnerable, talking about the things that I've struggled with in my life, inviting guests on to do the same, and then also having mentors and coaches and resources come on to share, to give people a place to lean into. When we launched the podcast, the immediate response was huge. It was awesome, and that has carried through. It's gotten as high as number 85 on Apple's chart for parenting podcasts.
Yeah.
So a lot of listeners, a lot of activity, and it's just been great to know, that people are watching it or listening to it. You can watch it on YouTube. You can find it on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else that you guys listen to your podcasts.
Domestic Dad future, what do you see?
What I would love to see, and my wife is grinning over there, but what I would love to see is a resource center for dads to come to, maybe even a 6-week program that addresses, the who, what, when, where, why, and how of getting your life back on track, to offer a real resource to men who are looking for an opportunity to, fix some of the things that they might see where they've gone wrong in their life.
Before we go to the break here, one more time, Nick, how to reach you, what's the best way to see the podcast, to go on the website, that type of thing?
Yeah, so the best way to reach me is through the website, www.domesticdadproject.com. You can email me, nick@domesticdadproject.com. You can find the podcasts on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or anywhere that you listen to your podcasts. It's Domestic Dad Project on YouTube and Domestic Dad Cleaning Up the Mess on Apple and Spotify.
I just love that title, Domestic Dad Cleaning Up the Mess, because life is messy. But you know what? It doesn't have to stay that way. And what you're doing is fantastic, Nick. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Nick Barnett, Domestic Dad Project. Be sure to check it out. We'll wrap things up here on the Steel Report in just a moment. And welcome back as we wrap up yet another edition of the Steel Report. Big thank you once again to Nick Barnett telling us all about his Domestic Dad Project. Also an update for you today. Remember a few weeks ago we told you all about the city of Cedar Falls and the Cedar River Recreational Area. Well, now that new area has a name selected by the public, and it's going to be called the Gateway Water Trail. And join us next week as I'll be taking you on the latest flight of the Eastern Iowa Honor Flight out of Cedar Rapids. a day-long trip to Washington, D.C. with our area Iowa veterans, and also a reminder all of our recent shows are on kwwl.com. Just find the Steel Report tab at the top of the homepage, click on the Steel Report, and there you'll find many of our recent shows. That's it for this week. Have a happy Father's Day, and as always, thanks for watching.